So Section D is titled Betraying the Revolution. The minority replicates the English structure of law through the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. Counter-revolution, coup, however you may want to look at it. But the purpose here is to kind of maybe take a different take on, what does the Constitution really mean? How did it come to be? Perhaps, again, differently than we have been taught or understand. Or maybe this is just affirmation to what a lot of you already understand or have done your own research on. So on page 127, there's a title of a book called The Whiskey Rebellion. We're actually not going to talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, but if anyone knows that history, this was the first instance where the newly formed federal government under the Constitution had to assert its power, in this case against farmers in western Massachusetts who were opposed to an unfair tax that basically made it less economically or less profitable for them to sell whiskey versus the larger producers. A lot of farmers use that as residual income to their farming operation, was to also distill whiskey. And they were going to be taxed basically the same rate as the big boys, and they found that to be unfair. There was a big outcry and mobilization. Eventually Washington sent 13,000 troops into western Massachusetts to basically let them know that, no, this is federal law and you will abide by it. So it was the first moment really where the federal government had to flex its muscles in upholding what the Constitution said around how the ordering, again, of government would operate. But we have this in there really just to point out a few things about George Washington himself. And one of the big things that I didn't realize, but he was one of the largest landowners of his time. In fact, from a wealth standpoint, I think probably pre-Trump was the wealthiest president we've ever had, based on current dollars. So on page 128, towards the bottom, you have a little bit of the history there about how he acquired his land. This during, I think it was the French Indian War, the governor, Dinwiddie there of the British government, basically offered land in payment to soldiers. So not so different than William the Conqueror did during the time of William the Conqueror. However, after the war had taken place, the government wasn't making due on their promise. And so Washington basically applied pressure to the government to make due on their promises to pay for that land. In large degree, he really wasn't doing it for the soldiers. He was doing it for himself, because he went out and basically bought out a lot of the soldiers who didn't believe that they would ever get the land, or were poor enough that they needed the income. And so Washington basically land speculated and then applied lobbying pressure, I guess you could say, to then get those deeds recognized, which eventually he did. On page 129, you can see at the top there it says that he eventually owned 63,000 acres of Trans-Appalachia, becoming one of the largest absentee landlords the Western country knew during his day. So obviously not only known from the Revolutionary period and politics, but also economically speaking, very powerful figure at that period of time. Skipping down the next paragraph to the third paragraph on page 129, it reads here, initially Washington's interest in developing water routes to the west had been almost entirely personal and profit-oriented. The canals themselves, though the tolls would produce income from investors, commercial traffic would bring prosperity to Virginia entrepôts such as Alexandria, and to new towns that would spring up along the trade route. What this is referring to is a lot of the land that Washington owned was basically landlocked. There wasn't good commercial access to that land. So he had owned all this land, but he couldn't basically extract the natural resources out because there wasn't basically a highway at that time to do it. The highway at the time of that period was canals. So it was about building a canal system to access the resources, then to pull the resources out, then to get it to market. So he had this situation that needed handling in the sense of being able to access his land. Again, remember, the mindset was at the time when this country was formulated that we had a bounty of these resources, and this is how we were going to build a great nation. So George Washington was very much of that mindset, that that's what needed to be done. and so he needed to access his own land and build these canals. Why this becomes important towards the Constitution, we're going to see here in a second. But he'd formulated what was called the Potomac Company. We may remember that from history class. And when we flip to page 131, this was really one of the main initial sparks to the formulation of the Constitution itself. So through the Potomac Company and wanting to build those canals to access his land, he needed to go about negotiating what that would look like with two different legislative bodies. Because remember, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no Commerce Clause. So anything of commercial interest had to be dealt with each of the individual states. So he had to deal with the Virginia legislature and he had to deal with the Maryland legislature because his land crossed the border lines between those two places. And that took a long time to get to conclusion, and a very frustrating process. Though in the end, he also had it subsidized, I don't know if entirely, at least in part, by the government. So you can say that was maybe the country's first corporate subsidy that was handed out, in this case to Washington, to build his canals. But that got him, I think, not only being frustrated, but thinking about, well, we need to do something different here because this is really affecting our ability to be a great power, obviously affecting his own pocketbook in the sense of not being able to move in the commercial way that needed to be done. So on page 131, you have what is known today as the Mount Vernon Conference. So after the signing, basically, of the documents related to the Potomac Company's enterprises to build those canals, he invited a few of the folks to his place to discuss this idea of commerce. So under the heading Mount Vernon Conference, this was in 1785, just to give you a time context. The Potomac Company laws were immediately followed by an agreement between Virginia and Maryland assuring freedom of navigation on the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay on the basis of complete equality. The commissioners who met at Alexandria, Virginia to draft the details of the pact were greeted by Washington and invited to adjourn to the quiet comfort of Mount Vernon. There in March 1785, they signed the agreement and included apparently Washington's suggestion a provision for annual consultations between representatives of the two legislatures to deal with commercial questions. So this idea of commerce was very much top of mind for Washington and others of his mindset. Some of the others that were also thinking along those same lines were people like James Madison. So at the end of the page on 131, that last paragraph, about 4 lines up, it says, when this idea reached Richmond, Virginia, State Legislator James Madison suggested a meeting of all the states. An invitation was accordingly sent out by the Virginia legislatures to all the other states, suggesting an early meeting to consider the trade of the United States and how for a uniform system and their commercial regulation may be necessary for their common interests and their permanent harmony, and to report to the several states such an act relative to this great object as will enable the United States in Congress effectually to provide for the same. So Madison, as we know, has been credited as kind of the main architect of the U.S. Constitution, talking with Washington about this idea of commerce and how the way things are currently arranged just really are an impediment, a barrier to really expanding that and widening that capability because of the way that the Articles of Confederation are currently constructed. So Madison comes up with this idea, well, let's pull everyone together around the table and begin to talk about this. That polling around the table on page 132 became known as the Annapolis Convention. That took place in 1786. So this invitation went out to basically to delegates of all the states to come together to talk about the commercial pursuits and what can be done to perhaps deal with the problems that George Washington was having in putting his Potomac Company together. It was a very poorly attended event. Only 5 of the 13 states were actually present. So the decision made was, well, we don't have enough people in the room. Let's try this again. And the trying of it again eventually became what we know as the Philadelphia Convention. So the place actually where the eventual Constitution was drafted, which took place in 1787, became that request from people like Madison and Washington to pull people together, to talk about this idea of commerce. In this next piece that Brad's going to get to, we're going to look at exactly what those delegates were charged to do, because I think it's a very sort of interesting and important piece of our own history is, well, what were those delegates meant to do when they showed up in Philadelphia? What was their official charge as representatives from the individual states? What were they asked to do as a group? because I think it really much comes into play when we talked about this idea of a coup or a counter-revolution coming into play. We see why that wording actually begins to make sense based on the charge that they were given as delegates to come to Philadelphia there in 1787. So you're going to turn to page 134 in your curriculum, and you're going to hear about what it was they were asked to do, as well as to get a sense about who these people were. Often history is kind of dry because it's just sort of dates and minor facts, but very little about who the real people were that were part of that history making. And so we'll get a sense of the actual men involved in the eventual Constitutional Convention.
Hi, is this a response, maybe you'll answer this in the next part, Brad, but a response to the perceived or real problem that Washington was having with the canals? That was the impetus for the...
Yeah, I think he was a representative of the frustration of the commercial mindset of, the haves, the wealthy landowners, the guys that were looking at, again, building a great nation.
And they couldn't build the canal. What was the reason?
Well, the reason was the negotiation between the states, that you had too many basically parties to deal with.
It was too cumbersome. There was no centralized authority. So it's kind of this mindset that, yeah, this governing document is all good and well for decentralizing authority, but if we're going to build this commercial empire, we need easier mechanisms to navigate.
Yeah, so think about how things operate today around most industries. Well, most industries, they find the easiest, most efficient means, as you talked about earlier, to embark on their commercial enterprises. And so they use a system of law today that streamlines that as much as possible. And so I guess from a business standpoint, or from that really the colonizing in a lot of ways of the natural resources standpoint, it was about looking for more efficient means to do that, because it was too cumbersome, too bureaucratic, too troublesome to do it under the Articles of Confederation. And so the Washingtons of his time wanted to improve that. And so that was his frustration, along with others who wanted to see something also different around that commercial commerce orientation. It wasn't the only thing, of course, they talked about in the Constitutional Convention, but it was a major component of what brought that body together in Philadelphia.
So one last reference to page 132 before we get to the next piece. Kai said it was poorly attended. You can imagine, well, I want to come, but the roads are bad, or only 5 of the 13 states showed up. But in that paragraph right below Annapolis Convention, the writer here says, I think this is a key moment, among the 12 delegates who came to Annapolis were 2 to whom Washington had fully opened his mind. These were Madison and Alexander Hamilton. They become key players in the Philadelphia Convention. The next excerpt is from the same book that the piece earlier about the Declaration of Independence being a blatantly illegal act is from. This is an essay in the book by a man named Robert Schuyler. So we're on page 134. And in the middle of the page, below the italics, Schuyler writes about the explicit mission that the Annapolis Convention gave to the folks gathering in Philadelphia. Actually, I should say that differently. The Annapolis report went to Congress assembled, and then Congress issued this resolution giving the delegates in Philadelphia this charge. On February 21st, 1787, Congress, etc., adopted the following resolution: that in the opinion of Congress, it is expedient that on the second Monday in May next, a convention of delegates who shall have been appointed by the several states be held at Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. Now, as an English teacher, when a student turns an essay in, one of the things I believe in is they have a chance to revise it. And it's not simply a matter of fixing commas or fixing spelling or capitalization, but looking at substance, keeping the essay intact as a whole, but adding detail, modifying narrative, changing commentary, but the thing remains intact. So when you say, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, that seems to be, you're keeping the fundamental document in place, but you're fixing some things, right? Schuyler goes on to say right below that italicized excerpt, it turned out that in sanctioning the Philadelphia Convention, the old Congress was in effect signing its own death warrant. Now, we'll get into how that changed and what the nature of the discussions in the rooms in Philadelphia was. But on page 135, Schuyler mentions a little bit about the nature of the men who came to Philadelphia and what their backgrounds were, what their frame of reference, perhaps their motivation was. In that middle paragraph, in all, 62 delegates were appointed, 55 attended some of the sessions of the convention, and 39 put their names to the Constitution which the convention framed. Think about those numbers and we'll sort that out as we go. Though sober history cannot accept Jefferson's eulogy of the convention as, quote, an assembly of demigods, unquote, it must be admitted that it contained a considerable number of able and a few remarkable men. The average age of the members was about 42. A large majority were lawyers with experience in public life. Only a few had seen military service in the Revolution. They were men of affairs whose business interests and associations, combined with their knowledge of practical politics, made them keenly sensitive to the defects of the existing regime. It goes now from revision to recognizing the defects of the existing regime. See how the mission is morphed. There's a visual of what Schuyler is writing about on page 137 by the political cartoonist Matt Worker. His representation of the closed door convention where the men in the powdered wigs gathered and shared their wisdom. They were men of affairs. There's two problems with the people outside the window. What's one you see?
American Native.
You got people there who would not even been in the consciousness of most of the people who would have been left outside. The other key problem is the room in which the Constitution was drafted had no windows. So there's not even the illusion of trying to peer in to imagine what was happening in the room. One of the things I like about the cartoon is its visual of this is who is allowed to be a person. Those men are around the table. Everyone else is outside. So if you imagine this giant Venn diagram, this giant rectangle is everybody who is a living, breathing human being, and then this tiny dot of the people who were allowed to be people according to the rules of the time. Even the first Constitution defined that. Then the second Constitution solidified it. So keep that visual. Don't color it like I did and post it on your refrigerator. We then move to page 139, a book by Vernon Lewis Parrington called Main Currents in American Thought. And he continues some of the descriptions of the men in the room. On page 140, just above the halfway mark, it's about probably 10 lines down from the top. So they're men of affairs, Schuyler says. Most of them were lawyers. Few of them had any military service fighting in the Revolution. Parrington goes on to describe their kind of emotional and philosophical orientation. They were realists who followed the teachings of the greatest political thinkers from Aristotle to Locke in asserting that the problem of government lay in arranging a stable balance between the economic interests of the major classes. Now, think about that statement. They were asserting the problem of government lay in arranging a stable balance between the economic interests of the major classes. Is that what the Declaration of Independence asserted as grievances? No. Right? So you already see in 1787, 11 years after the Declaration is written, 9 years after the Articles of Confederation are ratified, this move away from decentralized, deprivatized, I don't know if publicized is the right word, not preemptive to, this is about balancing the stability of the major classes at the top. The revolutionary conception of equalitarianism that asserted the rights of man apart from property and superior to property did not enter into their thinking as a workable hypothesis. The very conditions of the unsettled times were an argument against it. Property, they argued, is the stabilizing force in society. It is conservative and cautious, having everything to lose by social upheavals. It is a restraining force upon factional unrest. So you can imagine back in the 1760s and 1770s, the king in his court and the parliament railing against the rabble in the colonies and their unruliness, and they're unstable and they can't be trusted. What you have in Parrington's words here is the men gathered in Philadelphia see the people outside the same way. So look at how the power has morphed from separate from the king and parliament and all that British rule represents, and now we want to become just like them.
Brad, is it property as in land,
Yes.
or is it stuff? It has to
This
be
is land. Yeah, this is
Buildings?
yeah. And so Washington, the driving force behind the Potomac Company, Mount Vernon, Annapolis leading to Philadelphia, is all about 63,000 acres, expanding his commercial empire across state lines. That's what property means.
Not having an interest in a company a company like a service company or retail company, not a business person to actually only
It strikes me that it's driven by this manifest destiny, westward expansion. This is about, there are boundless resources out there because Washington wanted to build his canals to the west, capital W West. And so if we're going to expand this empire, gather up resources, in much the same way that the Penn Charter tells William Penn, you get all these resources, but make sure the vacuum hose is hooked back into England. They're modeling the same thing here. That's what property means.
And that's what they knew. That's what they had witnessed as far as the great nation powers, because it was really much about the nation state. How do you build a great power? And this is, again, post the war, the country was in debt. They owed money, and then they did very much look at the physical resources, so that physical property. Not money so much, the trees, the mining that can be done, the things that they knew that they could bring to market to then build the wealth and power that they wanted to see happen. In part, the mindset was, well, for our protection, so that we're less vulnerable to invasion. So there was still very much a lot of instability in the world at the time, and so the mindset was, well, we need to build the system such that maximizes our ability to do that nation building and to actually, again, protect that property such that we can then extract it to then get the value out of it to then obviously line our own pockets, but to build a strong nation. So that property orientation, was very critical. The commercial orientation was very critical in their mind to creating the stability, but also as the pieces point out, they didn't really have this democratic notion of rights and the other people. It was merely those who, again, the haves. How do we protect the haves? Because they're the wisest of the bunch, and so long as we protect them the best way, well, that's going to somehow trickle down and benefit the others.
And Parrington says continuing on the same vein. Parrington says that very thing. He says the propertyless, on the other hand, have nothing to lose, easily become the victims of demagogues, and embroil society with foolish experiments. The Republican experiment might work in America because property was widely distributed, but in the course of time, a propertyless majority would arise whose fickle and subversive will must be held in check. The problem, therefore, was to provide in time against such an eventuality. Then you have Madison, widely regarded, like Kai said, the father of, if not the architect or the author of the Constitution. And this comes up in his notes, which we'll get to in a minute, so it's kind of a double whammy of Madison. This is what he said in one of the debates in the rooms in Philadelphia. And think back to the levelers protesting against the Enclosure Acts. This belief that the commons should be held in common for all, for landless peasants. So that echoes into what Madison's saying, along with Parrington's commentary that they thought we got to have something in check against these hordes who will rebel and are unpredictable and unstable. This is Madison at the bottom of page 140. The landed interest at present is prevalent, but in process of time, when the number of landholders shall be comparatively small, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections? And unless wisely provided against, what will become of our government? In England, at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would take place. If these observations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interest of the country against innovation. Landholders ought to have a share in the government to support these invaluable interests and to balance and check the other. And here's the best gem. They ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority.
What would agrarian law be?
What the levelers were arguing for, that the commons is open and that landless peasants have a right to work to provide for themselves. And Madison says, if that happened, dogs and cats would be sleeping together, right? So we have to have something in place to prevent anarchy from breaking out, and the best way to do that is to institutionalize the power of the minority of the opulent against the majority. This is the architect of the United States Constitution. Jerry.
Isn't this also the time that in England the population is burgeoning, in Ireland the population is burgeoning, and they're shipping people to Australia as mining colonies?
And notice he says, in England, if elections were open to all classes of people, oh my God, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure.
Yeah, they're scared.
Right. So if the English get it, then why don't we get it? Even though the English are what we rebelled against. Right? So it's this snapping back violently and quickly at least in rhetoric, and the implementation of the Constitution had real consequences, but look at how quickly that snapped back and, to a higher level of centralization, privatization, and preemption.
There's a quote, it's not in your Bernays piece, but in doing some research I found that basically says exactly what Madison said in the Constitutional Convention as he was formulating his own view of propaganda public relations, where he says, ours, America, must be a leadership democracy administered by the intelligent minority who know how to regiment and guide the masses. So this, again, very much this Madisonian view of how government should be constructed, who should control it, and why that is the best way to create stability. Again, still using even words like democracy in the process, even though it was about protecting the powerful few. I mean, in modern terms, you can see the Washingtons were basically the 1% of today. I mean, they were the powerful few. Everybody else outside that window is the 99%. To kind of give it a different, more contemporary frame. That's the conditions that were happening, and that powerful 1% had a very different worldview than that 99% did around how government should be operated and how it should, who it should benefit.
Was there no, making that explicit and bold of a statement, was there no reaction to that?
Well, here's the thing, and I want you to turn back to the cartoon on 137. And Kai's going to walk us through some of the notes that Madison took, voluminous notes. We're talking doorstop thick book of the notes on the Constitutional Convention that Madison took. One of the stipulations that he wrote when he published the book was that it was not to be published, this book of the notes of the dialogues that took place over several days, that it was not to be published until everybody in the room was dead.
Wow.
Yeah.
The contemporary kind of equivalent to that, I think it was a couple of years ago now, John Kerry was asked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that a lot of people were talking about and wondering, what does it say? And we really don't know what it says because it's all being done in secret and no one can take the document out of the room. And I couldn't find the quote online, but Kerry pretty much said that, well, just like the Constitution needed to be drafted in secrecy, so does the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He may not have used the word secrecy, but the idea was, well, again, the powerful, opulent intelligent minority sometimes has to operate in secrecy to create something, again, for the greater good. So even in today's era, this echoing that somehow the small number, the 1%, are really looking out for everybody else, and hey, well, sometimes they need to do this without being bothered, and doing it in secrecy, or in Madison's case, well, we're not going to print the conversation of what transpired until everybody's dead. So that it's not an old thing. It's still very much alive today. It's just maybe called something different or presented differently, but that sort of worldview still continues, because in large degree we still have the same system that was put in place in the 1780s.
I'm reminded of a quotation, I think it's Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the country, if not the world. He said, yes, there is a class war, and my class, the wealthy class, is winning. And another thing, it was a picture of a protest sign in one of the marches recently this past year. The sign said, they only call it class war when we fight back.
Yeah, that's the cartoon on page 137,
Oh,
right? Because the people outside
yeah.
in the last couple months are fighting back, and
Yeah.
those inside are calling that the class war.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on page 144, we have just a little bit of what was actually talked about in that closed-door convention. There's two sources. One is Madison's notes, which is on 144 and 145, and then on 147...
You can get Madison's book online at Amazon if you're looking for some light reading.
Yeah, I think it's 600-700 pages. On 147, it's the notes from Robert Yates from New York State. Was one of the people in the convention and one of the people that did not sign the Constitution. But here, these are coming from the actual people who were in the room. As Brad mentioned, this wasn't made known until everyone had passed away. I think Madison actually outlasted everybody else. But, again, this idea of secrecy. In fact, that meant that none of the documents that were passed around could actually be taken out of the convention. There were armed guards posted outside the convention hall. Again, the windows were shuttered. So very much being done in private. And again, keep in mind that the people were gathered there for the sole purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. That was what they were sent to be in that room for. Of course, the product coming out of it was not that. Jim?
So to what extent were the unlanded class, the people who were outside of it, were they even aware of the convention? I mean,
After we go through these notes, we're going to look at some of the statements written by the group broadly known as the Anti-Federalists, who around the colonies knew about it and rebelled against it, at least rhetorically.
Yeah, I mean, at the exact time it was being done, I'm not too sure how aware people were, but I know there were a number of people in the convention who became staunch Anti-Federalists, who then got others to understand where this was all heading and why we should be in opposition to...
so it might have started out as a kind of a private meeting of the 1%, and then sort of leaks occurred and
Yeah.
became one.
Yeah, and I think the point is that this wasn't taken lightly. In essence, the formulation of the Constitution itself, there were a large number of people who did not want to see it ratified because they had fears of what it could become and the way that it'd be utilized, which were very antithetical to the Articles of Confederation and this idea of self-government and decentralized government. So on page 144, just to kind of hear from some of the people, towards the bottom where it says Saturday, June 2nd, 1787, you have a Mr. Dickinson just reading his first line. Again, these are the conversations being had about government itself. He says, a limited monarchy he considered as one of the best governments in the world. It was not certain that the same blessings were derived from any other form. So again, revolutionary period happened, a decade ago, about breaking away from this idea of monarchies. Yet here you have someone sitting in the room, basically saying, "Hey, we should probably go back to that type of government. That would be a good idea." On page 145, under Tuesday, June 12th, 1787, so a couple days later, you hear from Mr. Madison. He writes, this is his own writing of his own talking, I guess, observed that if the opinions of the people were able to be guided, it would be difficult to say what course we ought to take. No member of the convention could say what the opinions of his constituents were at this time, much less could he say what they would think if possessed of the information and lights possessed by the members here. And still less, what would their way be thinking 6 or 12 months hence. We ought to consider what is right and necessary in itself for the attainment of a proper government. A plan adjusted to this idea will recommend itself. The respectability of this convention will give weight to the recommendation of it. Experience will be constantly urging the adoption of it, and all the most enlightened and respectable citizens will be its advocates. So again, this, very overt elitism about, we know best, we need to formulate it such. The people out there, they really don't know anything, and, God forbid they actually had real power. We need to make sure that we deal with this, since we're in a situation now, and the way that government is structured, it's deficient to that. So we have an opportunity to do something about it. On page 147, these are now quotes from Robert Yates's notes that were taken. The first that we'll look at is from Mr. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. This is from the 19th of June, 1787. Yates records what Hamilton said here by saying, "I believe the British government forms the best model the world ever produced. And such has been its progress in the minds of the many that this truth gradually gains ground. All communities divide themselves into the few and the many," to get at what Earl just said a few minutes ago. "The first are the rich and well-born, the other the mass of the people. The voice of the people has been said to be the voice of God, and however generally this maxim has been quoted and believed, it is not true in fact. The people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Give, therefore, to the first class a distinct, permanent share in the government. They will check the unsteadiness of the second, as they cannot receive any advantage by a change. They, therefore, will ever maintain good government." So again, this idea of a certain class really being the ones that need to be in power because they can maintain the greatest stability in government. On page 148,
Which is beyond ironic. One of the central theses of the play Hamilton is about, and it's, the music is great. It's got a hip hop feel to it, and so that's why my kids love it. Hamilton himself was not part of the rich and well-born. He was an immigrant born to a prostitute, right? And so think about the way in which we colonize ourselves. He's enamored with the British form of government as the best the world has ever seen. The rich and well-born need a permanent interest in the way government is run, not these people like me who can't be trusted,
The deplorables.
the deplorables.
so page 148, we're going to hear again echoing the same thing we heard a few minutes ago from Brad around Madison, but we'll start a little bit earlier into his speech or conversation or comment made during the convention. So on 148, that second paragraph, under the Tuesday, June 26, 1787, I'm always wondered if Yates is taking a little bit of jab at Madison when he begins here. He says, "The man who is possessed of wealth, who lolls on his sofa or rolls in his carriage, cannot judge the wants or feelings of the day laborer. The government we mean to erect is intended for the last for ages. The landed interest at present is prevalent, but in the process of time they will be approximate to the states and kingdoms of Europe, when the number of landowners shall be comparatively small. Through the various means of trade and manufactures, will not the landed interest be overbalanced in future elections, unless if elections were open to all classes of people and property of landed proprietors would be insecure." And again, just to echo, because I think it's a very powerful statement around the eventual formulation of the Constitution itself. An agrarian law would soon take place, is the prediction, if we don't do something about it. If these operations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation. Landowners ought to have a share in the government to support the invaluable interests and to balance and check the other. They ought to be so construed as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And again, where he talks about innovation, what is he actually saying there? I mean, we may hear the word innovation today differently, but what does he mean by innovation? So when he says here that the observations be just, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation.
Liberal ideas.
Liberal ideas. I've heard a number of people say, progressivism, greater democracy. So this idea that if the 99% is going to mobilize and want to advance, greater rights protections, well, we need to protect against that possibility of that innovation, as he's saying, to take place. And then on 149, just to remind us again of kind of the craziness of what was being said in that Constitutional Convention. Again, realizing that we're only a decade away from the Revolutionary War, and what Thomas Paine was saying, that the revolution itself would have been meaningless had it not been about actually separating from that form of government, that it was about instituting new government. You then have people like Madison saying this. So on page 149, under Friday, June 29th, 1787, Mr. Madison, the states at present are only great corporations, having the power of making bylaws, and these are effectual only if they are not contradictory to the general confederation. The states ought to be placed under the control of the general government. You can probably replace general with federal, at least as much as they formerly were under the king and British Parliament. So again, 10 years hence, and there is this want to bring back the same system of which people fought to overthrow, and that this is where then they were leading to in the actual drafting of the second U.S. Constitution. It was asked, I think, by a couple people now around, what were people saying that were not part of the Constitutional Convention? And those people, as history wants to call them, the anti-federalists, did very much see what the Constitution could become if it was adopted. And so they were a number of those folks that were quite vocal in getting others to understand that and started to talk about that in public. And so on page 151, you have actual quotes from some of those anti-federalists, and Brad's going to walk us through that now.
This is a compilation of some anti-federalist writings put together by Richard Grossman, who was one of the co-creators of the Democracy School curriculum, and he was one of the teachers at the first Democracy School in July of 2005 when I was there. Just a little background and preface on page 151. That paragraph right below the middle, right below where it says, "but they lost." Grossman talks about how when the Revolutionary War was done, men of property still were in good shape. And so he says about 10% of the population controlled half the country's wealth. That echoes to today. Many had converted paper profits from wartime contracting and profiteering into land, mortgages, goods, and government securities. At the end of the war, the investments of the creditor class, as expressed in dollars, greatly exceeded their pre-war investments. War was good for their business. According to Howard Zinn, these wealthy planters and merchants thought they had it made. Quote, "The inferior position of blacks, the exclusion of Indians from the new society, the establishment of supremacy for the rich and powerful in the new nation, all this was already settled by the time of the Revolution. With the English out of the way, it could now be put on paper, solidified, regularized, made legitimate by the Constitution of the United States." Over on page 152, after Grossman goes through to the question about were there rebellions about what was happening in the Constitutional Convention, he writes about rebellions by farmers, workers, and debtors sprouting up in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and North Carolina. They took the form of blocking sheriffs from doing debtors' auctions. Some places took up arms, closed courthouses. On the top of page 152, Grossman refers to George Washington, who wrote, quote, "Commotions of this sort, like snowballs, gather strength as they roll, if there is no opposition in the way to divide and crumble them. There are combustibles in every state to which a spark might set fire." There's an inset portion that's kind of blocked in the middle of the page. This is a woman named Joyce Appleby writing about the implications of this beginning of snapping back and anti-democratic control. Foreign visitors in the 18th century invariably commented on the vitality of public discussions and on the political confidence of ordinary men. Had the states been left with the economic powers they had before the ratification of the Constitution, the momentum of popular politics would not have been checked. Never having lost the normal scope of legislative power, the states could more easily have maintained the traditional connection between the government and the economy. And then starting on the bottom of 152, I'm just going to pick out a few of these selections, and a handful of them, notice, are not signed with names. And so there were decisions made on the part of some of these writers to not give their real names for fear of retribution and recriminations. The first one I'll read is the bottom of page 152. A man writing under the name of Sentinel, who's thought to be Samuel Bryan in Pennsylvania, under who had written the Constitution and who were working so hard to rush it to ratification. In many of the states, particularly in the northern states, there are aristocratic juntos of the well-born few who had been zealously endeavoring since the establishment of their constitutions to humble that offensive and upstart equal liberty. Over on page 153, the second in Roman numeral 2, under what were Federalist organizing and public relations tactics. So some of this was pamphleteering, like the Levelers and the Sons of Liberty. The credit here is a pamphlet called The Address and Reasons of Dissent in the Minority of the Convention of the State of Pennsylvania, their constituents. A couple of lines here. While the gilded chains were forging in the secret conclave, the meaner instruments of the despotism without were busily employed in alarming the fears of the people with dangers which did not exist. And then skip down to William Grayson from Virginia, and he actually gives voice to some of these, the way in which the landed, well-born few were saying, here's what's going to come. You do this, and then look what happens next. We are now told that we shall have wars and rumors of wars, that every calamity is to attend to us. We shall be ruined and disunited forever unless we adopt this Constitution. Pennsylvania and Maryland are to fall upon us from the north, like the Goths and Vandals of old. The Indians are to invade us with numerous armies on our rear, and the Carolinians from the south, mounted on alligators, I presume, are to come and destroy our cornfields and eat up our little children. There's Bernays' propaganda again. Over on page 154, under Roman numeral 3, behind the language of we the people in the preamble, what were the real intentions of the Federalists? James Lincoln from South Carolina says, what does this proposed Constitution do? It changes, totally changes the form of your present government. From a well-digested, well-formed democratic, you are at once rushing into an aristocratic government. Robert Yates, who was one of the people inside the hall and decided not to sign the Constitution, says, the real effect of this system of government will therefore be brought home to the feelings of the people through the medium of judicial power. Remember, the Articles of Confederation had no Supreme Court. The opinions of the Supreme Court, whatever they may be, will have the force of law, because there is not power provided in the Constitution that can correct their errors or control their adjudications. From this court there is no appeal. I mean an entire subversion of the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the individual states. In Roman numeral 4, under what kind of nation would result, this is a man writing as John DeWitt, again under a pseudonym for fear of reprisals. Upon an attentive examination of the Constitution, you can pronounce it nothing less than a government which in a few years will degenerate to a complete aristocracy, armed with powers unnecessary in any case to bestow, and which in its vortex swallows up every other government upon the continent. In short, my fellow citizens, it can be said to be nothing less than a hasty stride to universal empire in this Western world, flattering, very flattering to young ambitious minds. It's almost like a direct dig at Hamilton, but fatal to the liberties of the people. And then finally, Over on page 155, under Roman numeral 5, what do the Anti-Federalists offer as alternative ways of thinking? We'll end this section with Patrick Henry. What, sir, is the genius of democracy? Whenever any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community hath an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it. That's direct language from the Declaration. In such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. This, sir, is the language of democracy, that a majority of the community have a right to alter government when found to be oppressive. But how different is the genius of your new Constitution from this? How different from the sentiments of free men, that a contemptible minority can prevent the good of the majority. And having heard Madison, heard Yeats, and the voices in the room and those outside the room and their critiques following ratification of what happened, we now turn to the text of the greatest living document ever in the history of written language, the United States Constitution, which I say with a healthy dose of irony and sarcasm. Cue the angel choir.
How much of this is taught in grade schools and junior highs and high schools today?
I can speak from my own experience as a teacher in the Spokane Public School System for 11 years, that none of this is taught.
It's like looking about.
We're protected.
Yeah. Yeah.
So 158 starts the Constitution, and as we've talked about a few different times, the focus here is not really on the Bill of Rights. In fact, the Bill of Rights in a large degree was a negotiating tool to get the Constitution ratified by the states. That was an offer made to make sure that the body of the Constitution would be instituted. Keep in mind also, though, that the Bill of Rights at the time it was adopted only really applied to about 8% of the population, because you have to be a white male with property to be actually seen as having any real rights under the new form of government. So like in a lot of ways the Magna Carta, the vast majority of people were not even recognized as really having real rights, yet they were supposed to be living under that form of government. And again, it's all kind of crazy considering that we had just formulated something in our history which was quite amazing in the sense of trying to actually embark on a new form of government. Here we were going back to pretty much the same system. And again, it's really contained in the body of the Constitution. It's not really the reflection of what the Bill of Rights talks about, that we should be, guarding in a lot of ways what it says because of the rights orientation that it has. Who's actually read the U.S. Constitution before? Anybody? All right, so we're going to kind of walk through it and just kind of highlight some pieces of it. You can, again, with all the other fine beach reading, include the U.S. Constitution as part of that. So on page 158, Article 1 on the left-hand column there, that is really laying out what? What does Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution talk about? The government talks about Congress. So this is everything having to do with Congress. Yeah, the legislative branch of the newly formed federal government. So under Section 2 of Article 1, you have what is the House of Representatives, so laying out how that process would work. And of course, those who could vote for their representatives were obviously a very small percentage because, those, like I said, only about 8% of people actually had voting rights, for instance. Yet these were supposed to be the representatives of all people. If you skip down to that last big paragraph in the left-hand column, just to kind of point out one of the negotiations that transpired in the Constitutional Convention around where power would be held within the new country. This is a pretty important piece. So starting there, it says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included with this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. So what is meant by that 3/5 of all other persons? Slaves. So that's what's also referred to as the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution. So it was a way for the southern states to make sure they had the greatest amount of representation in this newly formed government. So that slaves, who obviously were not seen as people but seen as property, and did of course not have any voting rights, would still be counted so that they could boost the number of representatives in Congress. So again, no surprise that most presidents early on all came from where? Southern states.
That was translated into the electoral college allocation for each state.
Yeah.
So how does that work? I've never really understood that. You know, how does a state, a rural state like Georgia, end up having more electoral votes than per capita than Washington State?
Yeah, we'll get to the actual language and then we can pull apart how that all works. I know there's been a lot of discussion lately because of the recent election, you know, should we be still doing the electoral college? Because again, as the time when this was ratified as today, the president is not popularly elected. We use this thing called the electoral college to determine who's going to be the next president. Same page 158, section 3, that right-hand column. This is laying out the Senate now. So in case the Senate of the United States shall be comprised of 2 senators from each state chosen by the legislature, therefore of 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Keep in mind that for 100 some years, senators were not popularly elected; they were appointed. So the representatives from each of the individual states, which again represented a very small percentage of the overall population, were then appointing senators. So in another way to look at it is the Senate is really the House of Lords. The Representatives is the House of Commons. The Senate is really the House of Lords in the way that it was set up, at least when originally conceived. Not much else to say on 158, 159. Let's skip to 160. This really gets at some of the powers of Congress, and you begin to hear things in relation to the Articles of Confederation, as well as the intentions of what they want to see this new governmental document be able to achieve. So on page 160 under section 8, that's that left-hand column, skipping to the 3rd paragraph where it reads, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. What is that referred to today if people reference that?
The trees.
It's the Commerce Clause.
It's considered the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So when we talked about the box,
Yep, that's it.
yeah, so that
2.5
weird,
lines.
awkwardly looking thing, that's the Commerce Clause, okay? And it's come out in a lot of different ways. Believe it or not, environmental laws are very much pinned to the Commerce Clause. Civil rights laws, a lot of them are pinned to the Commerce Clause, as well as the Commerce Clause being pinned to commerce. So it is a very, very powerful piece of our constitutional legal structure, and those are the words, believe it or not. That is the Commerce Clause. On 160, towards the top, the 3rd or 4th paragraph down there, clause down, says to raise and support armies, but not appropriation of money that shall be used shall be for a longer term of 2 years to provide and maintain a navy. Really, that became the authorization to have a standing army, perhaps not quartered in someone's home, but if we remember from the Articles of Confederation, they were very conscious of the fact that the military presence was something that the new government didn't want to see happen. The Constitution basically reinstituted this idea of having standing military around. Just below, to maintain a navy, skipping the next one and going down to one below there, it says to provide and call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. So when they say suppress insurrections, what are they referring to there? Who do you think the wealthy, powerful landowners were most fearful of? Slaves.
Slave revolts.
So it was the slave revolts. So again, we didn't dwell on it too long last night, but under the British in their enslavement of a lot of the Caribbean, they did very much the same thing. They wanted to make sure they had laws in place to then use physical force if need be, if there were slave revolts. So this idea of making sure that we have mechanisms to put down those insurrections, those revolts. At the very bottom on that right-hand column, just before or just above where it says Section 9, it says here to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying out into execution for the foregoing powers, and that all other powers vested by this Constitution, the government of the United States, or any department of, or officer thereof. People refer to that as the necessary and proper clause. So this idea of, whatever is necessary and proper to run the federal government, that's going to be in the hands of Congress.
And it echoes the language of the Penn Charter, which is all things to be discovered, yet to be discovered, all things whatsoever.
Page 161, left-hand column at the very top, where it reads, the migration and importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year of 1808. What is that saying? What were they saying there around 1808? What was that referring to?
Gonna allow you to move slaves around?
Yeah.
Charge?
We're gonna make slavery illegal, but only in 1808 and after.
Or we won't consider anything around the importation of slaves until that time. And why did they pick 1808? Well, the rationale was that they figured by that time there would be, and I don't know if those are exact words, but there would be enough of a local breeding population such that there wouldn't be a necessity to import people from somewhere else. That they would be able to reproduce slaves that were already on the continent, and that would not necessitate the need to import more slaves. They would have enough of a system to reproduce new slaves based on the slaves that were already there. Bottom of 161, section 10. This is where the contracts clause is contained. That'll come up later in today when we start to talk about the Dartmouth case. I don't know if you guys remember last night, Thomas mentioned something about the Dartmouth case and this whole idea of corporate rights. Well, that is all very much coming back to the contracts clause of the U.S. Constitution. So there's a lot of other things mixed in there, but if you were to read it such that it said, no state shall, and you were then to skip down a couple lines, make any, and then you'd skip towards the bottom, law impairing the obligation of contracts. It's another really piece of the box too. It's not just the Commerce Clause, but if you were to pass a local law banning factory farms and fracking, well, guess what? You're impairing a contract through either land leases or the permit or whatever it may be, things that are already contractually set up. And if you and your community tried to ban fracking, well, you'd also be running into the contracts clause of the U.S. Constitution. So it's also another important sort of side of that box.
And since it's come up, just for information's sake, right above section 10 is the emoluments clause.
So Article 2, what does Article 2 of the Constitution lay out?
What did you say about the emoluments clause?
It's in section 9, right above the contracts clause, in that bottom of the left-hand column. That's where it is.
Oh.
Article 1, section 9.
So Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, what branch of government is it?
The executive branch.
Executive. So that's where, Jim, in that second paragraph where it talks about the Electoral College. So it reads here, each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator, representative, or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. So you can see the mathematics that are used to figure out.
The number of representatives would accrue to the benefit of slaveholding states because they would get an extra 3/5 for every slave they had.
Yep. As one of the other democracy school lecturers calls it, an extra scoop of representation. So, and
The small states fare better than the big states in terms of number.
Right, to use Jim's reference, per capita, yeah.
flipping to 163, that's about all we really point out around the executive. 163, Article 3 lays out the final branch of government, which is the judiciary, the judicial. In Article 3, Section 1, it says here, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office.
Makes you wonder why they put that last sentence in there about the compensation.
Yeah.
Is that a way to, maybe to try to influence or control the judges? So we're gonna cut your pay, we're gonna do what we want, or?
What isn't in that paragraph there about the Supreme Court? What's something you may notice missing?
Terms.
Terms? What else?
How they're appointed?
Their number.
The number.
Right, there's no mention of how many,
Yeah.
right?
So technically, there could be one judge if they wanted to be. Over time, it's fluctuated, and they've settled on the number that they have now. But there's nothing saying that you have to have 9 Supreme Court justices.
But here's a fun image. At the beginning of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, there are 9 kings and 1 ring to rule them all. So make of that what you will.
All right, on Article 4, going to the bottom, so that's right-hand column, page 163. That last paragraph that will bleed over into page 164 says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof escaping into another shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. What is that?
Yep.
Slaves.
Fugitive
Did that
slaves.
include,
So it's called the bonded labor clause is what they refer to
did
it
that
as.
include indentured, like apprentices, that sort of thing, like the crafts used to have, where you'd come over from England and indentured for some number of years to learn how to make barrels or whatever?
Yeah, I don't know if it included, if you were held to certain labor, I'm assuming that it may have applied to those people as well. I mean, it was very much targeted, obviously, at the slave population. And I think that's also important, too, because eventually, the Fugitive Slave Act was adopted as a piece of federal legislation to reinforce what was already constitutionally there. And, of course, what did people do when the Fugitive Slave Act was put in place? Who didn't respect it? What did they end up doing? The Underground Railroad. So you had people defying federal law, breaking the law in behalf of actually protecting human beings from the consequence of that particular law, but also the constitutional structure that allowed such a piece of federal legislation to be put in place in the first place. So again, we point to the body of the Constitution being what it is, and we can then begin to see how it begins to operate in certain manners and who it really is protecting and who it really doesn't protect, or how difficult it is even to get certain rights recognized when the central document has very little interest in that type of action of government. And on page 164, a couple other things to pull out, and then we can be done with the Constitution and take a lunch break. Under Section 4, it says here, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republic form of government, and shall protect each of these against invasion, and on the application of the legislature or the executive when the legislature cannot convene against domestic violence. What do they mean by domestic violence there?
Slave uprising.
Slave uprisings. Also, though, what happened during the Reconstruction period past the Civil Rights or the Civil War? What was happening at that point in our history with another group of people? It's sort of the beginning of the organized labor movement. So you had often the federal government, authorizing military force against labor uprisings. So it wasn't just about.
Was there a glossary with this? Because the actual terms don't,
Yeah, what happens, this is the way the Supreme Court operates. It's So if you go back to the Commerce Clause, you look at those 2.5 lines, but the way in which the court cases have like worked as a glossary is things are quote unquote found in the Constitution. So there's a case in the Supreme Court, for example, of I believe it was Virginia, wanting to say no to municipal waste being trucked in from northern states because there wasn't room. And that was overridden by the Commerce Clause because trash is interstate commerce. And the only organization which has the right to regulate that is Congress. A state can't say no to that. So they find the Commerce Clause, they find the case in the Commerce Clause. When it says domestic violence, then it's found to be necessary to put down labor uprisings or slave revolts or other domestic insurrections. It's a magic judiciary device.
Okay, so the courts then further kind of parse it down to where it has
Codify,
a specific
yeah.
meaning,
Right.
inclusive or exclusive of whatever their deal is.
And that's also an adoption of English common law, because they adopt the method of which how law would operate. So this idea of judicial interpretation. And then, of course, when you have a system of hierarchy of law where you then have a Supreme Court and a Supreme Court ruling, that becomes precedent then. And so it's very hard to break precedent, especially when it reaches the Supreme Court level, whatever side it may fall out on. That's why you had Robert Yates saying, well, holy cow, if you have the Supreme Court, how do you undo something that is the Supreme Court? Because in some ways you can look at the ordering to say, okay, you have a president, which is akin to what in the British form of government at that time? A king. Then you had the Senate, which may be equivalent to what at the time? House of Lords. Then you had the House of Representatives, which were equivalent to what at the time? House of Commons. And then you put this other kind of layer that even sits above all that in some ways, which is this superior Supreme Court. So you get to see how people at the time of the adoption of the Constitution were like, holy cow, where is this going to lead? And you even have Supreme Court justices, if you dig into the history of that kind of decision making, they themselves even saying, when we make a decision, it is pretty much permanent, even though there are ways of which, the legislative body can come in and undo Supreme Court decisions. The likelihood of that happening is, slim to none. And so that is also why, when you start to look at the Articles of Confederation, looking at this more flexible way of judicial decision making and the ability to undo things based on the will of the people at the time, there was greater flexibility there, let's say, than something like a Supreme Court, especially then when you're adopting a system of law interpretation that says once law, always law here forward. It's very hard then to begin to undo things. Because the other thing we didn't mention yet really is that law in itself doesn't equal justice. I think we may understand that, but quite often people hear law and they somehow think that there's justice inside a law. And, well, justice has to be infused into the law, because the law is basically a rule, all right? It's a rule, and it may be just or it may be unjust. So from movement standing points, of course, people have to decide if they're going to live under unjust law or it be defiant to unjust law, because law by itself doesn't mean justice, just like a constitution by itself doesn't mean democracy. So there's a lot of things that get raised around how our system works, how laws are made, who makes those laws, who makes those decisions, and whether eventually we follow those laws. So we talked about the bonded slave clause in the U.S. Constitution and the Invention of the Fugitive Slave Act, and whether or not people were going to follow the law in that case. A lot of people saw that law as being illegitimate and unjust and said we are not going to follow that law. And so I think that is part of the tension again in various people's movements and that we find ourselves in today, which is, can we follow unjust law? And if we're not going to, then what does that look like in the way that we actually organize ourselves? Thomas mentioned last night that in his opinion we're at a point where we need a new constitution, that this document is old, it's antiquated, it served a function based on the worldview of the men at the time, but we need something new. Whether you look at it socially or economically or environmentally, we need a new governing document. Well, if we look at the Constitution itself, well, how do you go about doing that? What is the process? So just to remind ourselves, Article 5 on page 164, it says here, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for the proposing of amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all interests and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by their conventions of 3/4 thereof, as one or more of the mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. So, when we look at how the process is to amend the Constitution, what's something that may occur to you that doesn't exist within the way the ratification process works? Can we, the people, make a proposal to amend the Constitution directly?
Possibly if we had like a convention of the states as indicated in Article 5.
Through the legislative bodies.
Yeah.
But direct democracy of amending the Constitution does not exist. So for instance, you have the initiative process to amend state constitutions in some places, or to propose legislative changes through the populace. And if we look at the progressive movement of the early 20th century, the reason why the initiative, referendum, and recall process came to be is because, elected officials, corporate interests were not paying attention to the people, and they needed a new mechanism to make law. And so the direct democracy element came out of that frustration of our own legislative bodies not hearing the people. But we look at the Constitution itself, and we go back to what the folks who wrote the Constitution were saying in relation to who should have power and who shouldn't. Well, it makes sense that you would write an amendment process that's very difficult for it to be done democratically, that you'd want to have some control over that. So this is why we have the Congress being the percentage that it is and the state legislatures. It's a very difficult mechanism to see an amendment to the Constitution happen, let alone a constitutional convention that would open up a rewrite of the Constitution itself.
And Article 5 in very many ways just screams distrust of democracy and an absolute vindication of the things, the critiques the Anti-Federalists produced. If you set the bar at 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the state legislatures, you're making it virtually impossible to change this document. And think also about the mindset of the men in the room. You build in language to say we have to provide in the governing document mechanisms to put down slave revolts, so they know intrinsically their system is flawed and subject to uprisings, and they build mechanisms in to control it. And the revolution was fought with at least the spirit of open, expansive inclusion. And you have in the room the document that became this, everything of that closed down and betrayed, and a counter-revolution.
But couldn't you argue, though, that by putting that in, they said, we don't want this to be easy, but it could be done if there is enough of a discontent. There is a way you can do it.
Right, so the one parallel when I
King who says, no, you can't do it, period.
Right, when I started teaching at Shadle, it was governed by this thing called the Site-Based Council. And one of the bylaws was that any change in policy at the school had to be approved by 95% of the staff. I don't know how they came up with that, but that's a mechanism which is an unreachable bar. So yes, I think you're right. But if depending on the way you tilt the prism, the lens you're looking at, the Sons of Liberty, the Revolution, the Declaration were about fundamentally changing the paradigm, and what you have is this little tweak on the king. Yes, the king said you can't do that. What the Constitutional Convention says is, yeah, you can do that, but you have this much of a window. So,
Earl?
Rhode Island did not sign this.
yeah,
No.
you're right, Rhode Island is missing.
They were the last holdout to ratify the Constitution.
And one thing I wanted to point out about the numbers, and I don't want to make any correlation or causation agreements, of the, I believe it was 56 who signed of those who signed the Articles of Confederation, only 4 of those men signed the Constitution. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? The articles called for appointing delegates to Congress, and so those delegates changed. There were term limits in the articles. But you have Yates, who was in the room refusing to sign. You have people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who are conspicuously absent from signing the Constitution. So you can see a shift in philosophy and thinking away from the ideals of the Revolution to the ensconcing of permanent property and commerce in the Constitution.
Yeah.
Do you know how many people, I think maybe you told us, but I forgot, attended the Constitutional Convention and how many signed?
I think it said 55 were.
39 signed,
Yeah, about 55 are present for most or all of the convention.
55 attended some of the sessions,
And 39.
39 signed.
So I think we're going to break for lunch. Chart-wise, we're
One last question?
here.
I just wanted to
Yep.
say, this, I hear that Angel Choir with the mention of George Washington,
Mhm.
but it's sounding comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, and we don't talk about any of those folks at length. And we do, I think, preface it by saying there was a mindset. I mean, they had that kind of, corporate mindset, I guess, to give it an equivalent. And so that was their worldview. So they built a mechanism, a machine that fit their worldview of what they wanted to see happen. And yeah, there's probably some parallels to what we see with certain people in power today and what they want to see happen.
Is this where Benjamin Franklin was quoted as some woman asked him, what do you got? And he said, yeah, the Republic, and he was right after this. Was there any other similar republics established in Europe or Asia in place at this time?
I think France was getting there. I think they were the next in line. So when Thomas Paine wrote what he did in The Rights of Man, he was writing that from France. And that was right at the time of the French Revolution and eventually what became the French Republic. Right, so maybe try to aim for 1:15, give us a half hour, or do you guys want a little bit longer? Or? Okay.
All right, 1:15 for lunch, or for end of lunch.